Perfect. Well, it's great to be here. I want to thank the organizers. I know these events take a huge amount of work, so thank you for having me here. It's an honor. And I'll also apologize. There are two big lessons about how to keep people awake. One is don't speak after lunch. The other is don't use PowerPoint slides. But my first job was in the Pentagon, so I am incapable of speaking without PowerPoint slides. And unfortunately, this is too educated a group for me to usually do what those of us who work on the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative would do, which is just show you a bunch of pictures of land reclamation in the South China Sea. So I have to make an argument. So I'm going to try and be a little bit provocative here, especially for the Americans in the audience. So the question I was asked was, what is U.S. strategy in the South China Sea? And I think the conventional wisdom is that first, U.S. strategy in the South China Sea is failing, that gray zone coercion cannot be deterred, and that the next administration in the United States will be substantially tougher than the Obama administration has been. I'm going to argue that in reality, the U.S. doesn't have a single strategy in the South China Sea, and that's part of how we've ended up where we are. That much Chinese coercion, surprisingly, has actually failed, and that we need to look at the details of when Chinese coercion has been effective and when it has not been effective to understand how to respond effectively. And then last, that I think the high expectations that many people have for a possible Hillary Clinton administration need to be tamped down just a bit because a future administration is going to have a huge number of challenges in the region. So let me walk through each. And first, is U.S. strategy failing? As I said, my argument is no, because the United States doesn't have a strategy, so the strategy can't be failing. And instead, my argument is the U.S. has 4 separate strategies, and I'll say they can't actually all be executed at the same time. So the first, and I'll walk through each briefly, is what I would call containment. I think this is a smaller group than the rest of the strategies, but there are some Americans who support a containment strategy. Second is what I would call balancing, and I'll explain how I think that's different from containment. Third is accommodation. And fourth is integration. And let me just walk through each of these quickly. So those who argue that the U.S. should adopt a containment strategy tend to agree with John Mearsheimer, who argues it is crystal clear from the historical record that the United States does not tolerate peer competitors. As a result, Hugh White concludes that the U.S. aims include preventing Asia from falling under someone else's hegemony. It plainly means preserving the status quo based on U.S. primacy, right? So the assertion here from Hugh, as many of us have heard before, is that the U.S. seeks primacy. It can't fall back from that objective. That is a requirement. Primacy, therefore, requires that the U.S. manage China, not just manage China, but in fact contain it. Another argument is what I would call the balancing argument. And here, my boss is Mike Green, so I have to include him somehow in the presentation. He has a book coming out in which he argues that post-war American strategy in Asia focused solidly on alliance relationships and balance of power, right? So not on primacy, on alliances. So a very different root theory of how to continue U.S. engagement in the region. Similarly, Aaron Friedberg argues, through balancing, the United States aims to uphold its alliances and to preserve peace and stability by deterring aggression or attempts at coercion. So a somewhat different strategy here. Third, accommodation. And Fred Berkston here is one of the few who's really been acknowledged directly his views, especially on the economic side, for the U.S.-China relationship. He says, instead of focusing on narrow bilateral problems, the United States should seek to develop a true partnership with Beijing, a G2 between the U.S. and China. And he explicitly says that countries like Japan, Europe should be much secondary in U.S. concerns to the bilateral relationship with China. To that end, Charlie Glazer probably goes further than others in this regard, and he says the United States should negotiate a grand bargain that ends its commitment to defend Taiwan against Chinese aggression. It's the logical end of some of those arguments. And then third, John Eikenberry, arguing for integration, says China is rising in power, but also integrating. Asian countries want to join and help run the existing global system, not overturn it. So this is really about institutions. Bob Zellick obviously agrees. He said famously, beyond opening doors to China's membership in the international system, we need to urge China to become a responsible stakeholder. So my argument is these are four very different visions of US strategy in Asia, and they're not actually mutually compatible. So I'm going to look at two different elements. First, on the top, you have the view of Chinese intentions, and then on the left, you have the US view of the power trajectory. And I'm going to argue that in each one, you have a set of optimists and you have a set of pessimists. The optimists on the power trajectory and their view of Chinese intentions believe that it's important to integrate China into the existing system. I'd say increasingly many of those integration supporters have become more pessimistic about Chinese intentions, especially over, say, the last 5 years. And some have turned as far as considering containment as a realistic option. This is something I think 5 years ago you didn't really get serious people talking about. And there aren't many in Washington that will argue this, but you will certainly hear it in some circles. And then you have those who are pessimistic about the power trajectory, about the US ability to manage that power trajectory. And here, those, in my view, who are optimistic about Chinese intentions but pessimistic about the power trajectory suggest accommodation is the best strategy. And those who are pessimistic about both the power trajectory and Chinese intentions suggest this balancing strategy, right? That the US can't do it alone. It needs help from allies and partners, and so they favor balancing. So my argument is four different strategies with very different implications. And let me just briefly now talk about why that's important in the South China Sea. And the core question here is, can Chinese gray zone coercion be deterred? I'm using the word coercion intentionally here. I'm happy to have a longer discussion about why that is, but I think it's an accurate term. We at CSIS are just finishing up a year and a half long project on countering maritime coercion. And we look in great detail at 9 cases of coercion, spreading from 2009 all the way to today. Happy to go into these cases in more detail. But I would say the common view in Washington is that the Chinese are able to push, and the United States and its allies and partners have almost always failed to respond effectively to Chinese coercion. But in fact, that's not necessarily the case. So I do think that you can find incidents like the Impeccable incident, which are efforts by the Chinese to coerce us, the United States, into changing actions, right? To stop close-in surveillance flights, to stop close-in maritime operations inside exclusive economic zones where the US believes it's legal to operate. And in fact, the Impeccable incident, for example, was, in my mind, a clear failure for the Chinese. There are others, such as the 2010 Senkaku Diaoyu crisis, where I think the outcome is more mixed. And then there are others, such as Scarborough Shoal, which others have already talked about, which in my mind are clear coercive successes for the Chinese. But what's important here is that there's variation, which means that there's something to study. And so when we look at these 9 cases, I'll just put the rest on the screen very quickly. We see that actually of the 9 cases that we look at, only 2 in my mind are coercive successes for China. As I said, Scarborough Shoal, and then what we call Spratly Island land reclamation, although I'll defer to Dr. Thayer on this one. And you actually have 4 cases of coercive failure and 3 outcomes that I see as being mixed. So there's a lot of variation in the effectiveness of our strategies. And I would argue that part of this is because we've taken different actions in many of these incidents. And I think there are 5 key distinctions that we should think about in how US strategy is dealing with these kinds of issues. The first is the question of whether we want to deny and therefore do deterrence through denial or deterrence through punishment. The second choice is either to signal in private our commitment or to signal in public our commitment. The third is to have ambiguous commitments or specific commitments. The fourth is distant alliances or tight alliances, especially when the United States is worried about being entrapped in a conflict. And then the fifth question is to be risk averse or whether to be risk acceptant. And this may, other Americans in the room may want to dispute this assertion, but I will say that in most cases, recent US policies have tended towards this group of red actions. So they've tended towards deterrence through punishment, private signaling, relatively ambiguous commitments, relatively distant alliances, and an aversion to risk. I think there are elements in the US system that don't agree with that, but my view of the White House's view of South China Sea issues is along those lines. And in our year-and-a-half-long project, a good deal of which was on deterrence theory and getting famous deterrence theorists in to talk about what they think is most effective, those were actually the outcomes that in the theoretical literature on the right side in the graph should be most effective. Deterrence by denial, there's lots of literature on this, is more effective than deterrence by punishment in almost all situations historically. Public signaling is necessary because that's how you make a commitment credible. Specific commitments are usually necessary because you need to clearly tell your opponent what you're trying to deter. If you want to manage escalation risks, it's easier to do it with tight alliances than distant alliances often because you need to be able to be inside your allies' decision-making process. And then last, it is necessary to accept some risk to deter. And that doesn't mean that we have to accept risk. We can opt not to deter. But if we're trying to deter, then accepting risk is going to be necessary. So let me then say, I think you can think forward about 5 coercive scenarios in the South China Sea that we could worry about. And let me just briefly apply these lessons. So first, an unsafe air or sea intercept. The reality is, in almost all of these situations, the United States has demonstrated that it would be willing to escalate, and it's been effective doing so. So actually, that's a pretty easy case for us to deal with. A harder case is the South China Sea ADIS. Washington has often kind of threatened China that there will be repercussions if it announces an ADIS. I don't believe that's true. I don't think there's anything the United States is going to do that will stop China from announcing a South China Sea ADIS. We're not going to deter by denial because we can't prevent them from announcing it. And I don't think we're going to really deter by punishment by putting the kind of costs on China that would be necessary. So in my view, I don't think a South China Sea ADIS would be great, but I think we should be focusing elsewhere on deterrence. I'll say the same thing about Spratly Island's militarization. The level of risk the United States would have to undertake to prevent more militarization of the Spratly Islands is not a level of risk that I think anybody in Washington is willing to take, certainly not in this administration. Second Thomas Shoal blockade, I think there's more willingness on the US part to accept some real risk there. And finally, Scarborough Shoal land reclamation, as we saw in April when the US put a carrier strike group in the region, flew A-10s from Clark Air Force Base, there's some real risk acceptance there. So my argument to you is that when we think about these dangerous scenarios that might occur in the next few years, we should focus on the first, fourth, and fifth, and realize that the second and third, although many of us won't like them, are not things that realistically we're going to deter the Chinese from doing. And then finally, this last question in the last 2 minutes, will US policy change? My argument is the hopes are very high. I'm not going to talk about Donald Trump because I have no idea what he would do, and I don't know anyone who does. I don't know any advisors that he has. I can think of 500 people in Washington that advise presidential candidates, and I can't think of one that is advising Donald Trump. So I don't think we have any clue what a Trump administration would look like. But let's just focus on Clinton then as the one candidate that we do know something about. There's no question that the hopes are high. She was very effective as Secretary of State in a lot of situations, which is not to say she was effective in all situations, right? I think Scarborough Shoal was clearly a mistake by the government. But in general, I think people have pretty high hopes for Secretary Clinton. But we also need to remember that both the Bush and Obama administrations came into office with incredibly high hopes for focusing on Asia, for focusing on great power dynamics, and both were dragged back into the Middle East unwillingly, right? Neither particularly wanted to do so. If you look at the Bush administration strategy documents that they put out on September 10, 2011, or just 2001, sorry, those were very focused on Asia. And that's obviously not what ended up happening. And I would argue that if you look at the Obama administration's statements in Canberra and Darwin to kick off the rebalance, a lot of those promises have not been met. Whether it's that we can't get 2,500 Marines in Darwin, that we can't get TPP through Congress, I think the distraction elsewhere has been substantial, and I see no reason that that won't happen again. Secretary Clinton has already had to make a lot of commitments on what she's going to do in the Middle East to deal with terrorism, which is a real concern for much of the American public. So my last point here is that the next administration is going to continue to face many of the same core tensions over US policy that the current administration faces. I think we can all hope that the 4 strategies that I outlined at the beginning will be discussed, I think, more directly than they have been. We at CSIS did a study for Congress in January, and one of the questions that Congress tasked us to ask was, what is US strategy in Asia? And so I read every single strategy document, and we concluded there is no clear and coherent strategy from this administration on Asia. That was our first finding in the report, and we presented it to pretty much everybody we could find in the administration. Not a single person argued with me on that point. They argued on other things, but not a single argument on that one point. So I think we can hope that there will be a clearer strategy from the Clinton team, and in fact, they are going to have to put a strategy document into Congress in, I think, next May. So they'll be forced to do some of this early on. But many of these tensions, in my view, are going to continue and going to be hard to resolve.